Are we good? All right, okay. Welcome everyone to day 2 of the CDOIQ Symposium this year and the 17th edition. I'm Stuart Bond. I am Vice President of Research at IDC, and I'm focused on data intelligence and data integration software research. This morning we have Juan Tello with us to tell us about the future of data. Why are data metaphors wrong and right? Juan Tello is a principal with Deloitte's strategy and analytics offering and the firm's U.S. Chief Data Officer. He is responsible for fostering value creation from the strategic use of data assets throughout the entire data value chain of data, technology, process, and talent. Working with Deloitte's leadership, Juan defines strategies and execution initiatives to deliver an organizational goals by enabling business outcomes through data management, governance, analytics, and artificial intelligence. And could everyone please silence their mobile devices so we don't interrupt Juan in his talk this morning. With that, Juan, and I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. Thank you guys for being here. I always get really excited when I'm amongst friends. I think our community of data professionals is a special one, and one that when we're together, there's a lot of unspoken but fairly well understood commonalities in terms of what each of us are all experiencing in our own organizations. And so I like to first start out by saying, in my role as our Chief Data Officer, I'm responsible for our overall strategy and the execution of that strategy across all of our businesses. So like my other colleagues who are in the client service world, I once served in that capacity, serving clients, helping them define strategies and executing those. I am now responsible for doing that for ourselves. So I like to start with that just to put everyone at ease. When people hear, professional service organizations, they always feel like we're trying to sell you something. I am not here to sell you anything. There might be other Deloitte people here that want to sell you something. I am not one of them. So I am here to hopefully share our learnings in our journey. And so just as a overall background, Deloitte, and here goes one of the troublemakers. Deloitte is a global organization, roughly 350,000 employees. We've been around for 178 years. So when you think about the change that's required for an organization that's been around that long, and when you think about the complexity of data and how do you really transform an organization to be data and insights driven, that massive scale and that massive complexity obviously comes into play in our learnings and hopefully what we'll share with you today. Our journey started formally at the enterprise level 4 years ago. And so prior to 4 years ago, the way we managed our overall data strategy was individually based on each individual business. So we have 4 businesses: consulting, audit, advisory, as well as tax. And so each business and the supporting enabling areas, so think of those as our internal functions like finance and talent, all had sort of their individual pieces to the strategy. 4 years ago, we decided to bring our strategy together to bring the collaboration and the coordination that we needed to really help us achieve our business objectives. And so that sounds, I would say, very consistent and common to what we're all looking to achieve, right? How do we invest in all the right priorities to drive greater outcome, not just for one area of our businesses, but for all of our areas of our business? So that started for us 4 years ago. I was part of our overall leadership team that defined the strategy. The first 2 years I served as our consulting CDO, so I was a CDO for one of our businesses. A year ago, probably about 14 months ago, May of last year, I was asked to take on the enterprise role. And so that's a very important moment, at least in my career, and I think a lot of what's shaping this topic for me and how I've learned in that year. So just to maybe put it slightly different, going from a business that I know extremely well, that I play in extremely well, to a broader role with broader networks, a lot more complexity, different business models, was something that I would tell you in the last 14 months, I've learned a heck of a lot, a lot. And this whole topic is all about what those learnings are. And again, in the spirit of we're one community, I get extremely passionate about how do we collectively solve some of those really big problems that we're all facing. And so again, the goal for today is all around how do we help each other, and how can you maybe learn a little bit from the journey of our firm and trying to achieve more maturity in our data and insights capabilities. All right. I do like questions. I like to instigate certain topics. I don't believe there is a right or wrong in any of this, especially when it comes to data. There's so many different nuances. And so please raise your hand, speak up, and if there's anyone online, we'll figure out a way to get those questions onto the room here in person. So with sort of the background of our journey, metaphors have been an important trick of mine in how we talk about data. And it's almost gotten to the point where I feel we've overused them. I've overused them. And now when I'm talking to an executive and they're like, well, data's, the new oil. I'm like, that was 15, 20 years ago. And so it's just an interesting concept because we still find ourselves needing to somehow simplify everything that we're trying to achieve. And I've come to the realization, and again, in sort of my journey over the last 12 to 14 months, I come to a realization that there's a point in time and there's a sort of fit for purpose of a metaphor, but I do believe it also creates some false positives. And so we wanted to sort of start this conversation, and again, agree, disagree, ask questions. And so we wanted to start with the most common, okay? And these are, at least from our experience, our research and what we see in our day-to-day. And so the first one, it's a natural resource. How many of you have heard it's like oil, it's like gas, it's like water? Question?
Can you read them out? They're too small to read.
Sure, yeah. So the first one is, data is like a natural resource, oil, water, or gold. Have you guys heard that? Have you used that? Raise your hands. Yes. About half the room. You're smiling. You just used it yesterday? What's that?
I've heard it all the time. I've used it as well.
Yeah. All right. So what's true about the first one? What I like about it, and I am based in Houston, and in my client service days, I spent a lot of time in the energy industry. And so when, the metaphor of data is like oil, we got all over it. Like, yeah, this is great because oil and gas executives understand the value of a natural resource. They know how to look for it. They know how to refine it to ultimately create value or product that they can sell. And so from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. But where does it begin to start to fall apart? Where does that metaphor start to hurt us? The complexities around ownership and usage, for me, is a really big one. Because if I go and look for a natural resource and I refine it and I sell it, pretty straightforward. If I apply those same principles to data, we want to democratize it, right? We want to sort of set it free. And so that metaphor begins to limit or restrict really the value and the impact that data can deliver for your organization. All right, second one, it's a little similar, I would say. Data is like the raw material or the building block. This one begins to speak to data is one piece of a broader puzzle, again, to sort of solve those bigger, broader business issues or objectives. I like this one, honestly. I think a lot of how we try to solve some of our problems data is not an exclusive effort in the sense of we have a data project for the sake of a data project, right? It has to be integrated into a bigger set of initiatives or a bigger program. Like, I think that's one of the biggest things we've learned is, you know, how many of us have started to modernize our data platforms, moving from on-prem to the cloud, right? Lots of effort. Most of us are somewhere in that journey, halfway, maybe more than halfway. But what we learned in that was if we had a modernization effort, data modernization effort, as a standalone project that wasn't connected to what the business was looking to do, right? Were they looking to derive new insights in our finance organization? Were we looking to develop new forecast insights for how we manage our people, right? Our talent organization. And so what I like about this one is that it brings it into sort of a broader ecosystem of capabilities that you need to ultimately achieve the bigger, broader set of business goals. But is it scalable? I don't know. Currency. How many of you have heard this one? How many of you have looked at or thought about or have even maybe piloted the idea or the notion to develop a data valuation for the data that you have in your organization? Meaning, what is the value of my data? Not because you're going to sell it, but from a, you know, balance sheet perspective, just like an asset. If you are in the manufacturing world and you have assets around the world, what's the value of those assets? Can you create a data valuation for all the data that you have? I saw a raise of hands. You've done that? Yes. That's why I called on you. I know you've written and developed many different methods and frameworks around this. And it's interesting. I do subscribe to the notion that at some point our level of maturity around data has to include some form of evaluation. Will it be regulatory and will be enforced and it'll be part of your overall balance sheet? I don't know, but I do think it's an extremely important way to think about the value of data, and not in the way that I think most people immediately start to process this, which is if my data is valued at, you know, $3 billion, I'm going to go sell that and make $3 billion. I don't know if that's exactly where that will go, but to understand the value of that data, to then drive investments, I think is a very interesting way to think about how to truly untap and achieve all those outcomes that we talk about. So, another good metaphor. The last one is, it's like an organizational asset. And I've probably used this one the most out of all of them. I'm guilty of that. I often said, when you think about data, think of it like HR. Just like we have, you know, human resource departments in our organization that their entire mandate is to ensure the well-being of our employees. They think about who to hire, how many to hire, ensure that they have the right experience, to ensure that they have the right growth trajectory, to ensure that they're happy as employees. And it brought an element, a broader element of sort of the data team than before, right? Because it sort of created a bit more, at least for me and how I used the metaphor, a bit more of that complete, comprehensive view of this isn't a one-time thing, right? It's not about we are modernizing our data platform and once we do that, we're done, right? It has sort of an ongoing everflow evergreen, to use that word, evergreen construct of how we think about not only the data, but the teams and the capabilities that we build. And so, good level set, I would say. There's a lot of good use to metaphors. But what I've learned, and again, I've used all of them, some more than others, but what I really learned in this last 14 months in this role is it's a really good way to simplify, again, very complex topics, themes, but it misses a little bit of the how, or a lot of the how. It's more about what data is. It's trying to compare data to something that people can understand and very easily sort of start to develop a frame of reference. I believe the hardest part in our profession is the how. It is not the what. It is not the what. Yes, there's been a significant advancements in technology and lots of really good things happening. Data continues to grow. All those things add complexity, but at least, again, in my experience, it is the how you apply all those good things happening, all those good things you're building in terms of solutions that really sort of determine the level of success. And I would say we're all successful, right? We wouldn't be here if we weren't successful in what we do. But there's always that itch, at least for me. There's always that itch. Wow, we did this. It was really cool. One of the things, I guess to maybe give more examples, one of the things we did in this sort of 4-year journey that I would say we as a firm are really proud of is the notion of creating data products is probably one of those emerging themes, topics. A lot of organizations are thinking about how do I go from capabilities to data products to really help the democratization of data, to drive insights and all those good things we talk about. In our 4-year journey, we went from, we have capabilities, technical capabilities, we have data governance, we have data quality, we have a data reference architecture, but what are the data products that live and really connect all these individual pieces? And for us, that notion or that pivot from capabilities to products was extremely impactful. So we now have over 450, and maybe even now 170 if I remember the last scorecard. We as a firm have over 170 different data products that are accessible to all of our employees to be able to leverage in their day-to-day roles and work. That's powerful. And so when we think about all of that and what we've done, it really comes down to the how, right? Back to that point, metaphors were good, but how we enabled that was really, really important. So we're gonna have a little fun, and I do have to encourage you guys again to ask questions. I love when folks don't always agree, because again, I don't think this is black and white. But we're gonna have a little bit of fun, okay? But before we have fun, are there any questions? Any comments? Yes, sir. Data as the lifeblood of the business. Absolutely. It is in everything that we do, and that's what makes it both powerful but complex. How do you support, right? How do you support all the demand and all the requirements within an organization, just given the importance of it? So for sure. There was another hand.
So as you were building those data products, right, in the journey of those 170 data products, what was what were the quick wins that you were able to realize, and what was the toughest challenge that you had to face?
So the first part was defining sort of the construct of what does a data product mean to a professional service organization, right? And so if I was to play that back to each of you, like what would a data product really mean, and how do you define it? And so for us, we started with a information-oriented model. So what are the information domains that matter to us? There is a finance domain, there is a supply chain domain, right? There is a consumer domain, there is a risk domain. And once you start sort of having those big, broad information domains, then what are the individual data products that people want to use and leverage? And so that was the model, right? That was the categorization that we developed. And once we got everyone around, these are the 8 domains that matter to us, it was very easy to then go use case to an actual data product fairly quickly. So when we're talking to our finance organization, there's a finance domain. Okay, what finance data do you need? And how do we make it not only more accessible, but how do we ensure that it is comprehensive enough to support the 3 use cases that you have today, but support the 5 or 10 that you will have tomorrow? And so that was the approach. The quick wins were really about finding those 2 or 3 areas of our business that had hyper need for this type of consumption model. Because I think that's the other important part of what happens when you shift from sort of data capabilities to products. There's a unmet demand in how they consume these data products, where from a capability perspective, it's very technical, and there's a lot of dependency still on an IT organization or team, versus when you have a data product, the democratization and the access and ease, it's less friction to those data products. And so, long answer there, right? But there was 3 teams within our organization. I mentioned finance, I mentioned talent. Sustainability was actually the number 1 team that, given all of our, ESG strategies that all of our organizations have in motion, our sustainability team was like literally knocking on the door every single day. There's so much data out there. We don't have it all. How do we make it easier, right? Not only for us to define our strategy, but to manage, measure the commitments and goals that we've stated as an organization. And so that was our quick win, was find where there is unmet needs and there's a strong demand for easier access to this data. And I'm not saying reports, I'm not talking dashboards, right? I am literally speaking about the data as a product so that they can assess it, they can develop the insights that they need. Yes, they will require their own tools and technologies, right, to, again, make that accessible and easy. But at the end of the day, they were coming, right, for that data product, so.
Juan, we have a question from online.
Yes.
And before we get to it, I will apologize to the people online. I've been lax in getting the microphone over to people in the room. We'll correct that. The question is, and I think you answered it already, though, as the data product theme continues on day 2, how do you define data products? Are there any rules around what data products to build?
Yeah, I think that's the hard question. And I think that, right, that question varies by organization. For us, the domain construct was a very important one in terms of the data that we need and how we access it and the insights that we look to derive. And it has to be inclusive of the technologies and capabilities to enable that access. All right, one question?
If I may go back to the metaphor topic, have you considered not using a metaphor outside what data used to be pre-digital? For example, I think finance professionals have always been comfortable with balance sheets.
Mm-hmm.
This was data on paper as much as it is on systems. HR, I was lucky enough to work in the 80s, and I had to file my holiday request on a piece of paper. That was my data, and I was comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we are creating metaphors because we are avoiding the simple fact that people perhaps have developed an aversion for digital forms of data rather than data. Are we simply talking about the mess we created with the technology that prevents them from being natural interactors and actors with that data?
Yeah, that's it's a great point. There was a topic that I hosted with our Deloitte chief futurist, and he spoke about that exact point, that the growth of data has really just been through the digitization that's happening in our world. Data has been around forever. He went back to like the punch cards and P cards, and the way we thought about it then is probably not much different than we do today. But to your point, just the digital complexity sort of, I think, brings that layer of, yeah, exactly. Another question in the room?
This may be jumping ahead, and I'll apologize for that, but in your journey, were there any special challenges triggered by the fact that one of your lines of business is a highly regulated audit function?
Yes. Not jumping ahead. Definitely part of the learning and the role and our multidisciplinary business and the regulations that govern and mandate both our audit and tax business are very different than our advisory and consulting business. And that actually, I think, begins to really get into some of the way we're thinking about the future of our roadmap and the strategies that we're starting to put in place. So I'll definitely get more into that as we get into it. Yes.
Hi, Gilles from MIT. I perceive data as a resource, just like mining. There's a lot of it. If you want the gold nugget, you need to spend a lot of effort to get it out, to get a little bit of value. And so I perceive data as a cost center. What do you think?
Another metaphor, no shortage of examples. There's a yes to it, and there's the but on it. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I've heard a metaphor, just I guess in general, that I didn't necessarily agree with. I just think it's the nuances. And again, I guess maybe to bring it back to our learnings, it's not just getting to the data or getting to the data product. It's how we're actually engaging and activating the use of all that work. And so in the mining example, we're going to invest and we're going to dig to get to whatever it is we're looking for. How do we ensure there are consumers on the other end that are going to buy that are going to use that? And I would say I've been extremely biased to a fault in the last 14 months to ensure that it's not about the digging, it's not about how important it is, but it's about the use and adoption of what we're finding, right? The products that we're building, the solutions that we're delivering. And in that, I'll get to the buildup. How are we shaping the future of data? Any guesses? All right, we're gonna have some fun. I've not been in a meeting since February or March that hasn't included ChatGPT. So, like I'm still a consultant, I think, at heart. So like any good consultant, we said, well, let's ask ChatGPT. What does it believe the future of data is? I'm not kidding. And it's all depending on exactly how you ask the question, because we've tested this multiple times, but if you ask the question the way we did, this is the 7 things it gave us. And there was a lot of detail, as you guys know. There's lots of words behind each of these. But what I found interesting, which I think confirms my point on the good and bad of metaphors, it speaks to the what. It speaks to the capability. And it doesn't quite speak to the how. And that's where we're struggling, is the how. Now, some of these are obviously extremely important, and these are topics, themes, capabilities that should be in our strategy, it should be in our roadmap. For us, data privacy and ethics has been a very significant effort that we launched about 12 months ago. One of the first things we did, in addition to the notion of creating data products, was we needed to ensure that we had the appropriate rights to that data, and more importantly, that we were using it ethically within our guidelines. And so these topics for sure are top of mind. No one would debate them. But it didn't help me in really helping advance our overall maturity as a data and insights-driven organization. So these are fun. Again, wanted to maybe get a chuckle or two. But here's the real ones, at least not according to ChatGPT, but according to myself. All right, the first one, data is a business. There is a lot of individual themes and topics within this. We started thinking about this first because of what was making our job, our roles extremely difficult. And the first thing we found was, and there was a comment in the back around this, just the breadth and depth of data. And there is not any individual team or function or business in your organization that doesn't need these capabilities. There's none. Everyone needs them. Yet, the way your individual team might be organized, the scope and the responsibility of that team might not be as broad to support everyone, or it might not have the right decision authority. And so we started to compare my role to our CEO's role. CEO has full responsibility of our overall organization, and he has shared responsibility and accountability with other leaders for the running of each of those individual pieces. And so when you think about it that way, it's like, okay, and I'm not here to say the CDO should be the CEO, don't get me wrong. But what I'm trying to say is, how do we learn from that operating model? That our mandate truly is as broad as the mandate and responsibility of a CEO. And yet, in most cases, at least in our organization, we don't have all the right authority to operate with that level of breadth and depth. And so what did we do? That's the problem. That's the problem. How do we start to pivot and run our team like a business? And so, very similar to the CEO, CEO has his direct reports, and they all have their individual set of responsibilities that ultimately map back to the overall business goals. So we tried to apply the same. Now, we don't have the stick, we don't have the mandate, and some of that we'll get into the two other learnings. But that notion of shared accountability, the notion of the CDO is responsible for everything is, I think, what we're challenging. I don't believe I'm responsible for everything. Not with the ambitions, the breadth and depth of what data and insights can do for an organization like ours. And so how do we find that shared accountability across other leaders amongst the firm? And I'm not talking sponsors. I'm not talking sponsors. I don't like sponsors. Can I say that? I can't say that. Sponsors are good. Sponsors are good, right? Because you need that sponsorship from other parts of the business. But I want to assign real accountability for parts of our strategy, for parts of our initiatives to others in the organization that can really help with that growth and that use and that adoption. And so we've started to change the way we think about the role of the CDO. Yes, question?
So do you measure the utilization in terms of value in the organization in order to accomplish that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Could you maybe just repeat the question?
Yeah, so do we measure the value?
Right. So like the sales organization needs
Yep.
a certain set of data, they come to you, you provide it, provision it. Do you then, based on what you just said,
Right.
do you then go back and measure the utilization so that you can validate the cost structure?
Yeah. So there's different metrics that we leverage. The one that I'm most excited about, and I think I even talked about this a year ago, it's still in pilot mode. Couldn't say it's widely used across the firm, but the notion of, so there's, I would say, the standard metrics that we use. So when we think about a project or a program or initiative that we launch, there are sort of all of the financial business metrics of we're going to invest X, here's going to be, you know, the return on that investment, very much from sort of an IT perspective, and then we do the same from a business perspective. So if we're developing a solution for, you know, a business, what is it going to help you do? Is it going to help you sell more? Is it going to help you grow your customer base, right? And so we have all those technical and business metrics associated. We're trying to challenge and or maybe advance that thinking. And this kind of goes into the data valuation construct. But we've developed a data value index, which is a scale of 1 to 10 that we can tell you for any individual business or sub-part of a business, their data value index, which is a calculation of ultimately how data and insights driven that part of our organization is. And it takes into account all the investments, it takes into account the use of that product, it takes into account the return, the ROI of that product. So it's a very interesting construct. We've piloted it. What I would tell you that we learned from that exercise is the first part was how do you do the math? Like what is the formula was the first part, and to our surprise, there's already lots of formulas out there. And so tweaking or modifying formulas to get to the one that makes sense for your kind of business, right? So we're a professional service firm, so there were some nuances for us, but once we figured that out, which was hard but not the hardest was getting people to agree and defending that this is the right formula. Because there was lots of, well, why didn't you include this? Well, no, why did you include that? I wouldn't have included that. And so that's why we're still in this sort of pilot phase. I'd love to be able to get to a point where we have a data value index for our 4 businesses that the CEOs ultimately feel accountable for.
But then those individuals who are utilizing the data have a shared responsibility, right?
That's right.
That's the point.
That's right. That's right. All right. Find the super connector. I do have to maybe confess. By background, education, computer science, but I did have a year where I went to want to become a sociology major, and so a lot of this comes from that. But I'm just a very inquisitive, social. What are people doing? What are they saying? And it kind of goes back to the how. So just if you guys follow along with me, it'll make sense, I think. But I've always been extremely curious just about the sociology of who we as people, how we interact, and specifically in a professional construct. And so there's been lots of research. I mean, this is not necessarily, new emerging research. When you think about Stanley Milgram, who came up with the 6 degrees of separation, and if you follow that philosophy or understand the research that was done, 60% of those connection points were the same 4 people, right? So if you follow the, hey, we're 6 people removed from one another, 60% of that time, we're connected by the same 4. And so the notion, and again, based on what research or philosophy you subscribe to, the notion of being a connector is an important one. And I think it's really important in our business, in our profession, just because of everything we talked about, just the complexity of what we're trying to achieve. Finding the right super connectors is like magic. And we often, so when this notion first came about, you often think about, well, who are the leaders of that function? Who are the leaders of that business? And you try to connect, you get the sponsorship with the hopes that the solution that they are sponsoring is going to achieve the ROI of the business case. And if all of you are as ambitious as I am, it never quite gets there. A lot of good stuff, a lot of great things, but it's never, ever there, and maybe even exceeding. And so this notion of finding the right connectors in your organization, and some of the statistics are quite interesting, right? Like 5 to 10%. So, less than 1 out of 10 people is a super connector. There are lots of traits to what defines a super connector. There are certain tests that exist out there, so feel free to research to see if you're a super connector. I found out I'm not a super connector, which I was shocked. I was shocked. There's someone in this room that could have probably told me I wasn't a super connector, and I had to learn that the hard way. I'm not going to look that way. But finding the super connectors is extremely powerful. And the super connectors aren't necessarily in and around the roles that we're playing. They don't have to have this sort of, data competency or data fluency. It's more about who they know that can ultimately help achieve our goals. And so I'm fortunate to have a super connector in my team. Super fortunate. That person does a really good job of scheduling meetings on my calendar with people that I'm like, why are we talking? What are we doing? And I've gotten way better. But it's the connection. It is that connection that has actually resulted in some pretty amazing things. Speaking to someone that is a super connector that has really no role, nothing to lose, nothing to gain in our strategy and roadmap, but because we met and we shared what we were doing, they were able to connect us to other teams that could truly, truly take full advantage. And so it was sort of this organic grassroots kind of effort, and I'm hooked on it. So if there's a way we can look and say, okay, that's a super connector, that's what we should invest in and develop a product for that. Because those people are magical. The outcomes that they're going to help you achieve without them even wanting or knowing in any direct way, it is pretty impactful. And so I know this can be applied to so many things. Research out there has applied this to lots of different teams. But I feel it's extremely important to the world of data, just because it is extremely complex, it is broad, it is deep, it is very nuanced, and both top down and bottoms up hasn't quite worked. And so how do we tap into the super connectors in our organization as another element, as another lever? I don't believe there's one thing that's going to ultimately help or solve everything we need, but I find it as a very interesting concept. So I encourage you to find the super connector. They come with the really strong communications, change management, sort of set of skills and experience, if that was to provide some guidance. So you should have one. Everyone should have one. Probably one of the best things that happened, at least in my journey. All right. Next one, which is sort of a build on this, but it's also an interesting one. The trust and diversity paradox. The notion here is we find people like us, that think like us, because it's easier to trust one another, but it limits or minimizes the diversity of thought. And this study that was done by Brian Uzi, who's a professor at Northwestern, essentially says, if you go to 10 people and ask them for advice, 8 of those 10 go to each other. And it creates this echo, what he called echo chamber construct. And so when you think about that, and again, you anchor it on how do we drive change different? How do we drive more growth, more maturity in the capabilities that we're looking to achieve for our organizations? Having an echo chamber, going to the same people, you're going to keep getting the same answers. Pretty common sense, but how? How do we apply that? So one of the things we did was we went from, and this was all part of that shift of capabilities to products, but in order to bring more diverse thoughts, more diverse set of teams, you have to overcome that trust barrier. And one of the ways to overcome that trust barrier is by having a shared, what Professor Brian calls a shared activity. For us, we created shared committees around our priorities and our initiatives that had leaders or team members from a very diverse set of parts of our business and functions. And so the first part was they sort of overcame that trust element of, well, you're not in my team, you do this and I do that. They all rallied around the shared activity, which was one of the most successful ones for us. And I was an advocate, but also a bit pessimistic about it. But one of the biggest efforts for us this past year was around our data literacy program. Data literacy is a top topic. We all need it. We all need to do it better, and it needs to scale and be tailored right to the uniqueness of each of our individual organizations. We created a shared activity by developing a committee that brought together lots of different people that would have traditionally not come together, different parts of the firm. And it wasn't because we're going to go and talk about data, but it was because we were going to start to talk about how do we help our employees truly become more data savvy. And so that shared activity, that shared goal across a very diverse set of individuals, one, allowed us to bring a more diverse perspective. So we went from going to 10 people that went to the same 8 to, going to 40 different people now to get input and feedback on how we as a professional service organization should design and deliver a world-class data literacy program. And I can tell you this, if it wasn't for that, I don't think we would have achieved what we achieved. It's extremely hard. Data literacy at scale is an extremely hard effort to successfully achieve. And through that notion of the trust diversity paradox and bringing different people in that aren't necessarily experts, again, in data or in training, I think allowed us to achieve more than we would have. And so, I guess in closing, and we'll open it for questions, it's all about the how. It's about finding the right people in your organization. Might not have a formal role, and in some cases you want someone outside of sort of the data world to really help you continue to advance your mission and your strategy. So with that, I'll pop up 2 QR codes. As I started, the first one's all about us helping each other. I am constantly learning, not only from our own journey, but would love to learn from yours and how we can help one another ultimately continue to advance this profession is, one of my top priorities. So please go there and help us shape that. If you want access to some of our thought leadership that I shared and or described, that's what the second one is for. Any other questions, please reach out to Jordan, who's actually here in the room, and she'll be more than happy to help. But I guess with that, I'll pause and see if there's any final comments, questions. I know you mentioned you were going to throw some eggs at me or something.
Juan, we did have a question online. This is back to earlier discussion about data products. Can you comment about governance of data products as a technical asset in the organization?
Governance model, yes, we govern our data products. The notion of there has to be a business owner for that product. So for all the domains and the individual data products, someone in the business is responsible for that. Now, what does that mean? The use of that product is where we index. Where we store it, how we manage the access to it is more on the IT side. But the use of that data and that sort of decision right sits within the business owner. Yes?
Coming back up.
Since we have a couple of minutes, and this may be like throwing an egg at you, this question, but the issue about sort of these highly regulated areas and some of the special challenges in a organization with multiple lines of business. I'm just curious if you could share some observations on the impact in your journey.
So I guess where I would first start is there are shared capabilities, products that support the enterprise. And then there are very specific solutions that take into account sort of the regulations that each of those businesses have to abide by. And so the way I think about it is we have a common enterprise reference architecture that includes sort of the entire stack of capabilities we as a firm need. The activation or instantiation of that architecture is where we begin to see some flexibility. and specifically in those two regulated businesses of ours, the policies, procedures, and management of that data is highly varied to the other ones. And so I see it connected on paper in that reference architecture, but then how we instantiate and the products and solutions we built are very different from our non-regulated businesses.
Good morning. The data product thing, I think, is a loaded term for me, at least, and I don't know about others in the room or online. I think I understood you to say a data product is really the data for use by the population at large at Deloitte. I wonder if there's the potential or risk that could be misused as well if people aren't properly equipped to be able to leverage those data products. So how have you sort of overcome some of the challenges of, I almost refer to it as sort of data malpractice. You take a pile of data and you do things, but you lead to effectively deformed outcomes.
Yep.
So how have you addressed that with
Yeah.
Deloitte?
So how many remember the notion of data marts? So there is a bit of curation that has occurred, and there's a little bit of philosophy, subjectiveness in terms of how do we take a raw data product and how much do we need to curate it so that it is to some extent protected so that someone can't use it in ways that they shouldn't. So there's a little bit of that we go from raw to some level of curation. I call them data marts. My team doesn't like that word because, we're so much modern now. But we have data marts, and they are somewhat connected to those domains that we referred. But there is still a request or governance step in that process, and it goes back to ownership. And so when a practitioner in this part of the business wants to access these 4, 5, 10 data products, we know already, based on the classification of the data that's in there in terms of use, if it requires special approval or not. And so those are the two methods that we apply. One is most people won't have access to the raw data. It's curated based on some domain. And then there is a formal business process approval, depending on the classification, sensitivity, et cetera, of that data asset or data product. Another question in the back?
I suppose Deloitte existed before you arrived there in your current
178 years
position.
ago. I mean, I know I look old, but
So what, when you arrived in that role, what were the biggest challenges and how you overcame it to arrive to where you are today? What were your strategic priorities, and how do you see what are your next priorities going forward?
Last question, by the way.
all right. I'll try to keep it short. Highly matrix organization with a lot of autonomous decision making in this area. So each business was doing their own strategy and the activation of that strategy. And so bringing together the value proposition, the business case on, we're all doing these 10 things, and we're doing it 10 different ways. And so it was a little more about bringing that shared agenda together. That was the first part. And most people have a lot of common sense, and if the numbers are there, they say, yeah, okay, I'm going to stop investing individually, and we'll combine all those investments. So that was the first one, but I think we got through that fairly quickly. It was really the return on that investment, which goes back to the how and the use and the adoption of these now integrated set of capabilities and solutions that we're building. our unlock there was to go from we have a data quality capability to all those pieces were embedded into our data product construct, right? So that was the big unlock and learning for us. Good?
Thank you so much, Juan. Really appreciate the insights today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
The next session is at 10 a.m. Thanks.